Hi, everyone, and welcome to our first forum on artificial turf. I'm Jordan Weinstein, a town meeting member from Precinct 21, and we thank you for joining us tonight for this first of our two independent forums on artificial turf. It was once called AstroTurf when it was first introduced. Artificial turf has become ubiquitous on athletic fields around the country. We, in fact, have two of these fields right here in Arlington, and more are proposed by the town. In recent years, artificial turf has become the subject of new research suggesting that the plastics and chemicals used in it and on it are in fact leaching from these fields into nearby wetlands, streams, rivers, and in some towns into their drinking water supplies. There's a growing body of evidence that these chemicals may be linked to some serious diseases and disruptions in young developing bodies. So before our town installs any more of it, we filed a warrant article to temporarily suspend any further installations of artificial turf until it can be thoroughly studied. We're going to get the latest science from Dr. Kyla Bennett, a major researcher in toxicology. And here to introduce Dr. Bennett is Robin Bergman, a town meeting member in Precinct 12, and a longtime political and environmental activist, and the co-founder of the statewide Trees as a Public Good network. Robin.
Hi, everyone. Our guest speaker tonight is Dr. Kyla Bennett. Dr. Bennett previously worked at EPA Region 1 for 10 years as a wetland permit reviewer and as the region's wetlands enforcement coordinator. She has a PhD in ecology and evolutionary biology from the University of Connecticut and a JD from Lewis and Clark Law School in Portland, Oregon. She was one of the two scientists who discovered PFAS in artificial turf in 2019. And she currently serves as the New England and Mid-Atlantic Director and Director of Science Policy for Public Employees for Environmental Responsibility, known as PEER. I've been lucky enough to attend multiple forums featuring Dr. Bennett, and I know you'll find her presentation enlightening as well as concerning. After the presentation, there'll be a Q&A. You're welcome to put questions into the chat, and we'll take them both live and from the chat as we have time. Dr. Bennett, it's all yours.
Thank you, Robin and Jordan, and thank you to all of you for inviting me here tonight. I'm going to share my screen. I'm going to talk to you about the myths of artificial turf because there are many. And before I get started, I just want to make sure that we're all on the same page so you understand what artificial turf is. It basically has 4 layers, and it's plastic grass on a plastic backing with infill to hold the blades up. So underneath it all, there's usually a shock pad because artificial turf can get quite hard very quickly and can cause concussions. So there's a shock pad which gives a little bit of bounce to it. Then there's a plastic backing into which these fake blades of grass are woven. And then the infill, most people don't understand this, but the infill is actually sprinkled on top and it holds the blades upright. So the infill is not underneath, it's actually sitting on top of the backing and the shock pad that helps hold the blades up. So artificial turf is bad for the environment. And for decades, environmentalists were focused on the crumb rubber infill. For a long, long time, the only infill that was used was ground up tires. And this was a problem trying to figure out where we could get rid of tires. If you think about all the cars in the United States or around the world, there are a lot of tires that cannot go to landfills. Most landfills prohibit tires from being dumped there. And so they decided the tire manufacturers decided that if they ground this stuff up, then maybe they could use it for something else. And they called it a beneficial reuse and got EPA's approval. And they started using it for playgrounds and as infill in artificial turf. Now, part of the problem with the crumb rubber infill is that it leaches a whole lot of chemicals. So we now know that crumb rubber is dangerous. It has PAHs, it has a lot of metals like lead and cadmium. It's got volatile organic compounds, plasticizers, carbon black, which somebody from NIH called recently the 800-pound gorilla in the room. styrene, other carcinogens, flame retardants, all sorts of stuff. And because there has been so much concern over crumb rubber, industry has shifted away from using crumb rubber. It's very unusual these days, aside from my town, which put in artificial turf with crumb rubber. Most people use what they call organic infills, and we'll talk about that in a little bit. So because industry is moving away from crumb rubber towards these organic and other infills, they're saying it's now safe. And what these organic infills are, it's not organic in the sense of you go to Trader Joe's or Whole Foods or Wegmans and buy an organic vegetable. Organic simply means that it was once something alive. So they have things like walnut shells, coconut husks. One of the most common these days is something called Brockfill, which is an engineered wood. And then aside from the organic infills, they're also using things like ground up Nike sneakers, silica sand, and things like that. But unfortunately, these new types of organic infill does not solve the problem of toxic artificial turf, because the turf itself, the grass blades, the shock pad, and the backing, and even some of these new organic infills contain very toxic chemicals. In 2019, I discovered with another researcher from the Ecology Center in Ann Arbor, Michigan, that artificial turf contains per- and polyfluoroalkyl substances, otherwise known as PFAS. PFAS, you've probably been reading about them in the news lately. They're everywhere. They're a class of thousands of chemicals. We don't even know how many there are. It really depends on how we define the class of chemicals, and I'll get into that in a little bit as well, but they're nicknamed forever chemicals. And the reason they're nicknamed forever chemicals is because every single PFAS is persistent because of that carbon-fluorine bond. All PFAS have a carbon-fluorine backbone, and that bond between the carbon and the fluorine is one of the strongest bonds known to humans, and it's very difficult, and in some cases impossible, to break. So all PFAS are persistent, many of them bioaccumulate, and all that we have studied are toxic. And just so you know, these three things, persistence, the ability to bioaccumulate, and toxicity, we call them the PBT chemicals. Those are the three things that EPA looks at to determine whether they should ban a chemical or not. And in this case, we've got all PFAS are persistent, many bioaccumulate, and all that we've studied are toxic. So they're pretty bad chemicals. So here's the article that was broken by two publications simultaneously, The Intercept, Sharon Lerner, and also the Boston Globe. These are some discarded rolls of turf that we found in Franklin, Massachusetts, and we took samples of them and also took samples of the water in the wetland that's just behind these rolls of turf. And we found the same PFAS that were in the turf rolls also in the wetlands. Now, PFAS were actually discovered accidentally in 1938 by Chemours scientists. They were working on something, and some of this new chemical that they had created spilled on one guy's shoe, and then he spilled some water and he saw that the water beat it up. And he thought, oh, this is handy. I made something waterproof. So it's been around for quite some time, 1938. And now today in 2023, PFAS are everywhere. They are ubiquitous. They're in carpets, carpet cleaning products, food packaging, particularly things like microwave popcorn bags and pizza boxes and bakery boxes. They're on our upholstered furniture. And a study just came out that showed they don't actually work to prevent stains on furniture. So they're there for no apparent reason other than to poison us. They're in our cosmetics. They're in outdoor gear like tents and ropes for sails on sailboats and backpacks and things like that. They're in a lot of waterproof clothing. They're in a lot of home repair items like adhesives, sealants, and glues. They're in the aftermarket protective coatings like you spray on shoes, nonstick cookware. Virtually all of those nonstick pans have PFAS in them. They're in things like children's car seats, which is horrifying, and also firefighting foam and the actual turnout gear that our firefighters wear. This is particularly horrifying to me, and we have a number of firefighter clients, many of whom have cancer. In 2019, 75% of online firefighter deaths were due to cancer, 75%. Crazy. So what do PFAS do to you? All sorts of horrendous health risks. Increased risk of diabetes. They are endocrine disrupting compounds. They lower your chance of getting pregnant. They reduce fetal growth. They can increase your blood pressure and cause preeclampsia in pregnant women. They increase your cholesterol levels. They do cause cancer. They are known to cause kidney and testicular cancer. They alter your metabolism. They reduce your immune system function and vaccine response. And they also increase thyroid disease. They increase childhood obesity, and they have all sorts of learning and behavioral issues in children. So part of the problem is that I have to let my dog out while I'm talking to you because she's barking at the door and I don't know where my husband is. There are differing PFAS definitions, both within EPA and also around the country and between the states. EPA has a working definition, and they define PFAS as two adjacent carbons, one of which is fully fluorinated, the other at least partially fluorinated. But states are having a much broader definition, and they say that PFAS are substances that contain at least one fully fluorinated carbon atom. Why is the definition so important? You can't regulate what you can't define, and different definitions of PFAS will lead to vastly different numbers of PFAS. So even on EPA's websites, they have one website that says there are about 6,000 PFAS. They have another website that says there are over 12,000 PFAS. We don't even know how many they are because we don't have a consistent definition. And if your definition is too broad, you're going to be capturing benign chemicals possibly. And if your definition is too narrow, you will fail to regulate the toxic chemicals. Part of the problem with PFAS, and this is an actual billboard from Chemours, one of the companies that makes PFAS, and they say, let's change the formula. And that's exactly what they do. Every time EPA or one of the states start regulating or becoming concerned about one of these forever chemicals, they tweak the formula a little bit and create a new chemical that is not regulated. So we call these regrettable substitutions, and there are many, many, many of these, thousands of them. So how toxic are they? Currently, states regulate PFAS in parts per trillion, and it's really hard to grasp the concept of a part per trillion because it's so tiny. And the industry likes to use this as trying to make it appear that these things are safe. So they say, oh, 1 part per trillion is 1 droplet of water in an Olympic-sized swimming pool. How can that little of a chemical cause anything problematic? But it's actually exactly the opposite. These things are so toxic that 1 droplet of this stuff in an Olympic-sized swimming pool is very, very dangerous. So the concept of a part per trillion, it's 1 penny out of $10 billion, 1 ounce in over 31 million tons, 1 second in over 317 centuries, and 1 droplet of water in an Olympic-sized swimming pool. That's how toxic they are. Don't let industry tell you, oh, it's so minute, it's okay, because it's not. On March 29th of this year, just a few weeks ago, EPA proposed MCL's maximum contaminant levels in drinking water for 2 PFAS, the 2 legacy PFAS, PFOA and PFOS, and also they did a hazard index for another 4 PFAS. They said that in drinking water, they are proposing a maximum level of 4 parts per trillion each of PFOA and PFOS. And they did that because they feel like we can't measure it accurately below that level. They're wrong. Labs, commercial labs can measure it down to 2 parts per trillion or even lower. But I think EPA didn't want to piss people off too badly. But what they said in their preamble to this rule, there is no dose, and I'm quoting, there is no dose below which either chemical, PFOA or PFOS, is considered safe. In other words, there is no safe level, 0 safe level. Like lead, there is no safe level of this stuff in drinking water. Now, unfortunately for us, there are 3 routes of exposure for PFAS. You can inhale it, you can absorb it through your skin, which is what's happening with our firefighters because it's in their turnout gear, and you can ingest it through your food or your water, or if you get pieces of artificial turf in your mouth, which children do. I hope this isn't too hard to read, this little graphic of the PFAS cycle, but the reason I put this in here is because I want you to understand how difficult it is to get rid of PFAS. Because it's called a forever chemical, we can't burn it. We can try to incinerate it, but what happens is it goes up into the air and then it can travel about 150 kilometers. And then it just falls down to the ground and gets in other people's water and soil because it cannot be burned at regular incinerator temperatures. You can put it in a landfill, and then when you've got precipitation, snow or rain, what happens is it leaches out in that landfill leachate, and then that leachate is shipped to a wastewater treatment plant. And when that leachate is brought to a wastewater treatment plant, the wastewater treatment plant, they are not created to remove PFAS from the leachate or from any influent. And so scientists have actually measured the amount of PFAS in the influent, in other words, the stuff going into the wastewater treatment plant, and the amount of PFAS coming out. And they found that there's actually more PFAS coming out of the wastewater treatment plant than went in. Why? The reason is that PFAS chemistry can be quite complicated, and there are precursors to PFAS, so chemicals that can become PFAS, and they recombine in the treatment process and actually create more PFAS. So we can't landfill them, we can't burn them, we can't put them through wastewater treatment plants. Can we filter them out of water? Kind of. We can filter out some of them, but then those filters that are full of PFAS are now hazardous waste that you can't do anything with. You can't landfill the filters, you can't burn the filters. So we're stuck. We don't know what to do with all of this PFAS. It's so bad that EPA actually offered a $50,000 reward for anybody who could figure out how to destroy PFAS. That's how bad it is. Let's get back to artificial turf. PFAS leaches off of artificial turf fields into water. Dr. Graham Peasley of Notre Dame University and one of his PhD students, Heather Whitehead, have tested dozens of samples of artificial turf. We have found PFAS in every single one. We have yet to test a piece of artificial turf that doesn't have it. Industry will say, we don't use PFAS, we don't have it in ours. And they'll give you lab results. Usually they're bad lab results because they did the testing the wrong way, the detection limits were too high, or they just didn't test it properly. But real world examples show that water around artificial turf quickly becomes contaminated with PFAS. In Martha's Vineyard, a consultant, Tetra Tech, did a study that showed that 12 parts per trillion of the 6 PFAS that Massachusetts regulates leach off a brand new field. As the field ages, as it's abraded, as it's subject to acid rain and UV light from the sun, more will leach off. So think about this, 12 parts per trillion, and EPA said that 2 of the 6 that Massachusetts regulates, there's no safe dose. And this stuff is going right into your groundwater, into your drinking water, if you are not in an MWRA town. If you are in an MWRA town, it doesn't matter because Massachusetts will regulate PFAS in groundwater and also in soil. Another problem with artificial turf is that it sheds microplastics, a lot of microplastics, 480 pounds a year. Consultants will tell you, oh no, it doesn't break. Why would they make something that breaks? It breaks. I've got great videos if you want to see them. Artificial turf also contributes to climate change. Natural grass, as you know from your high school science class, absorbs carbon dioxide and releases oxygen. And artificial turf does exactly the opposite. It releases carbon dioxide, it releases methane, and it releases other chemicals. One study showed that the manufacturing, installation, service, and disposal of 1 2-acre artificial turf field is responsible for the generation of 55.6 metric tons of carbon dioxide over the lifetime of that field. In contrast, natural grass has a net reduction of 16.9 metric tons. So if your town cares at all about climate change, this is something that should concern them. Industry says, Oh, real grass requires pesticides and fertilizers. Real grass requires too much water. Real grass doesn't give you enough playtime. Real grass is much more expensive. Artificial turf is green because it can be recycled. It's sustainable. And some still say we don't have any PFAS of concern, or even we don't have any PFAS in our turf. They also say organic infills reduce the temperatures by 40 degrees Fahrenheit. One of the things about artificial turf is they can get as high as 180 degrees on a day like today. Artificial turf will be about 140 degrees. None of these things that industry say, none of them are true, not one. Artificial turf is just bad for the environment. There's no benefit. The environmental damage will be felt for decades to come. I understand that drought and climate change is an issue, but artificial turf is not the answer because you're contributing to that climate change. Artificial turf does not handle extreme precipitation well. We've got pictures of them flooded after a strong rainstorm, ripped up after a hurricane or tornado. I mean, it just doesn't handle extreme weather well at all. Industry will tell you artificial turf is the gold standard, but it is not. And some industry reps don't even know that they have PFAS in their products. Artificial turf is also bad for athletes. A peer-reviewed pre-publication article that just came out, 2023, concludes there are cancer risks as a result of a chemical exposure from artificial turf, particularly for children. ACL injuries are more likely to occur on artificial turf than natural grass, and artificial turf exhibits higher frictional coefficients than natural grass, which results in both foot and ankle injury rates. They also can get hard if towns don't maintain the fields the way they're supposed to be maintained. Artificial turf is not maintenance free. It takes a lot of maintenance. And unless you constantly work on this stuff, it's going to get hard as a rock and it can cause awful concussions. Artificial turf is also bad economically. It's more expensive to maintain properly. It does need watering, especially to cool it down. It does need to be replaced, and the infill needs to be replaced every year. Why does it need to be replaced? Because it migrates off the field. So those little pellets of whatever it is will migrate off the field. The potential liability issues here are huge because EPA's proposed MCL on PFAS, and because Massachusetts has one of the strongest PFAS regulations in the country, we're going to start to see towns and cities being held responsible for contamination. Indeed, it just happened in West Tisbury. Mass DEP sent a letter to the town of West Tisbury on Martha's Vineyard and said to the town, we're holding you financially responsible. You contaminated these private wells, not through the artificial turf because they're still fighting that, but from their fire station. So we are going to start to see these lawsuits coming, and some of them are going to be against the municipalities who are putting these turf fields in. Artificial turf is also not recycled in the US. We hear this all the time. I was at one presentation by a landscape architect, and he said, oh, I toured the recycling facility in Pennsylvania. It was a beautiful facility. It was perfect, wonderful. You should see this thing. It was gorgeous. It doesn't exist. There is no recycling facility in Pennsylvania. They're trying to build one. Pennsylvania DEP has cited them and fined them because they've got all of this turf stockpiled everywhere and they're making a mess, but they have not even built the facility yet. That's the Pennsylvania rematch one. A couple nights ago, I was doing another one of these talks, and the consultant, Chris Huntress, said, oh, we're going to recycle your turf field. And in Texas, there's a brand new plant in Texas. And I said to him, really, is that Exxon's advanced recycling plant? And he said, yes, it is. He was so excited. Well, they use pyrolysis, which means they burn it. That's not recycling. Exxon is greenwashing it and saying when they incinerate this stuff, it's called advanced recycling. That is not recycling. It's far more damaging to the environment to burn this stuff than it is to even create virgin rubber. So the bottom line is there is no recycling of artificial turf. And I guarantee you that anyone trying to sell your town artificial turf will tell you that it's recyclable and it will be recycled, and they are lying. So again, back to the liability issues, because sometimes money speaks volumes, and sometimes this is the only time you can get a town to pay attention to you. EPA's new MCLs will open the door to huge liabilities. States are making even more stringent MCLs, and Massachusetts is already looking at EPA's 4 parts per trillion, and they're going to have to lower theirs in response. And they're thinking about regulating more PFAS than EPA is. I mean, they do right now, they regulate 6. There are class action suits for contaminated water everywhere. If your town insists on having an artificial turf field, you must require PFAS-free materials, and those tests must be done by an independent lab and must include the leaching tests, because that's when we find the PFAS. If you just test the turf, you may not see the PFAS, but if you do an SPLP leaching test, what that shows is what's going to come off that field and get into your soil and water, and that always, always, always shows PFAS. States are also trying to ban artificial turf. There are bills pending in California, in Massachusetts, Vermont, it just passed the Senate, and in Connecticut. The writing is on the wall. These things are not going to be around much longer. And in response, industry is now saying that they're going to make artificial turf out of 80% soybeans. I don't believe it's possible, but we'll see what happens with that. And even if it is made out of 80% soybeans, it's still 20% plastic, and they probably still need the PFAS, so it's not going to solve the problem. So in conclusion, artificial turf is a bad idea environmentally, it's a bad idea fiscally, it's a bad idea for the health of your athletes, and it's a bad idea because of climate change, and it's also a bad idea for your surrounding communities. If you have people who grow gardens or kids who play in the soil next to these things, very, very dangerous. The bottom line is you have to try to get this passed, because you're going to be looking at years of contamination and possible financial liabilities for your town down the road. And I'm happy to take any questions that you have.
All right, thank you very, very much, Kyla. I see a hand, Marianne Finneran.
When you're speaking about and thank you for the presentation, Kyla, it was very, very interesting. When you're speaking about liability, what it reminds me a lot of is the cost of disposing of asbestos siding on a house. Somebody buys a house and they find out they've got asbestos shingles. You can't put those on a house now. And it costs them a fortune to get rid of it. And they spend all of their time and money encasing them and wishing they could get rid of them. And it sounds as if this artificial turf is very much the same. So the question, and this is more for you, Jordan, is what can we do as a group to, what action do we need to take right now to ensure that the town doesn't put down any more artificial turf than it may already have?
We have a warrant article coming up at town meeting, which begins on April 24th. The warrant article basically will create a study committee, and while that study committee is meeting, if this article passes, there will also be a simultaneous moratorium on the town installing or using any new elements of artificial turf anywhere, in order to give the study committee some breathing space and be able to investigate this for as long as it needs, primarily for up to about 2 years, but we don't think it would need to go on that long. So if you're not a town meeting member, what we're going to do in the chat is put in there links for a way for you to find out what your precinct is and who your 12 precinct meeting members are, and we'll be able to get you the email addresses of all those town meeting members. It basically depends on our ability at town meeting to get a majority of town meeting members to support the study committee and the moratorium.
Because we're on the cutting edge of regulating PFAS right now, people are disposing of artificial turf. They're just like stockpiling them. We have one place in Washington state that's a mountain, literally a mountain of artificial turf. We found them dumped in wetlands. We found them dumped in alleyways, in the woods. People just put them anywhere because there's nothing to do with them. So you don't necessarily have a guarantee unless you force the person who you're buying it from to promise that they are going to take care of the problem at the end of its life. But when I was on this meeting the other night, one of the Conservation Commission members said, you know, well, what happens at the end of its life? And the consultant said, well, that's not going to be your problem. That's not for another 10 years. Well, it's going to be someone's problem, and it's definitely going to be the town's problem. So it's a great question, because as we start to regulate PFAS more, there may not be any place to put these things, or if there are places to put them, it might be extremely expensive.
Take another question, this time from chat. Robin has that.
Right. Michelle Phelan says, thank you for the information. It's very helpful. As my constituents and I live next to Thorndike Soccer Field, adjacent to wetlands, it's a field that floods regularly. How would artificial turf negatively impact the wetlands adjacent playing fields?
It's going to do two things. First of all, it's going to increase the amount of water going into that wetland. And it's interesting that EPA actually considers artificial turf an impervious surface in their MS4 permit for Massachusetts. So because artificial turf is considered impervious, like asphalt or concrete, when we have a extreme precipitation event, it just runs off. And, you know, if it were grass and soil, the rain would sink in and recharge the groundwater. But this stuff is just going to run off and flood the wetland. But in addition, it's going to bring with it pieces of the grass blades, any of the infill, and even that Brock fill. I don't know what kind of infill is being proposed for your fields, but the Brock fill, the engineered wood, we found high levels of PFAS in that. So those chemicals are going to be brought into the wetland and impact all of the plants and animals that are in that wetland.
Okay, Eugene, if you just unmute yourself.
Yep, thanks. Thanks for this very informative presentation. I have 4 questions related to this. One is, do you have any idea how much petrochemicals it takes to, let's say, make a soccer field sized field out of PFAS?
It's a lot. I don't know exactly. I do know that it's each field, just not the infill, but just the field itself, and the backing weighs about 40,000 pounds. So however much fossil fuels it takes to make 40,000 pounds of plastic.
RCRA, you know, RCRA says that you have to be responsible for the hazardous waste from one end to the other. So is the town going to be responsible if EPA adopts standards under RCRA for this? How's that going to work?
So we've been pushing EPA to adopt PFAS standards under RCRA, but they haven't yet. They are regulating PFAS under CERCLA, which is the Superfund site, and under the Safe Drinking Water Act. Those are the only 2 acts right now. If they do start regulating it under RCRA, which is the cradle to grave statute, yeah, but you know, because Massachusetts DEP regulates PFAS in groundwater, soil, and drinking water, you're going to be responsible right off the bat to DEP. So it could be a 21E site almost immediately, which is, you know, the state Superfund law.
Yeah, so this is proposed to go on top of an old municipal landfill that I read the RIO today, and it looks like there's nothing significant in there, except that the field keeps sinking a little bit because as the organic matter deteriorates, you're going to get sinking. What's it like to put one of these fields over an old landfill that still is deteriorating?
It's a really bad idea because it will sink, you know, just like anything you put on it, it will sink. The plastic is heavy. This stuff is really, really heavy. So if you've got organic matter that is breaking down, you're going to get divots or holes or depressions, and then it's going to be impossible to take care of. Unlike if you put a natural grass field, you can always import more soil. You'd have to rip the field up to put stuff underneath to put it back down again. It would be insanely expensive to take care of a problem like that.
Okay, that's good to know. And last question is, Do you think the use of this field will violate the town's MS4 permit?
It might, because the MS4 permit does say that artificial turf is considered impervious. So what watershed are you in? Do you know?
Mystic River.
So that is one of the, it's interesting, that's good for you guys, because that's one of the 3 watersheds that EPA said they are going to be using their residual designation.
But they haven't done it yet.
Yeah, so I would try to do a residual designation petition. If you fail at town meeting, that's what I would do. I would go to EPA, because I understand that the regional administrator there, David Cash, is very eager to use the residual designation authority and stop things like this. And they do. I can send Robin afterwards, because I have her email. I can send her the permit appendix that calls artificial turf an impervious surface, if that would be helpful to you.
So if the town were to do this and it gets into a wetland and it flows into a waterway, that would be significant. It sounds
Well,
like.
under the Massachusetts Wetlands Protection Act, you know, an alteration is defined as a chemical change to a wetland. So I know Alana is here with us tonight. She and I were fighting something in Boston on this in front of the Boston Conservation Commission, and they claimed that they had no jurisdiction over PFAS going into wetlands, which is absolutely false, and we are going to fight that. So theoretically, the minute that field goes down and something gets into the wetland, if they are going to put it down, I would strongly urge you to test the water and the soil in the wetlands before the field goes in, so then you can prove that there has been an increase in contaminants once it does go in, which will be easy to prove, and it will happen in a matter of months.
Thanks so much, Kyla. Appreciate it.
Thanks, Eugene. Robin, you have a question from chat.
So there's another question from Michelle Phelan. Does the use of white pine pebbles over black rubber pellets make a difference at all? One of our adjacent towns has installed white pine as an alternative. Any comment? Yeah, so there are studies, and I can also send this to you, Robin, so you have it. The industry is starting to say now, I heard this last night, that if you use organic infill like the Brock fill, which is it's pine, that the temperature will be reduced by 20 to 40 degrees. Totally not true. There are a number of articles that say the temperature will go down a couple of degrees, but nothing significant. It's the plastic blades that make it hot. The black infill from the crumb rubber does make it a little bit hotter, but it's really mostly those plastic blades of grass. So it doesn't matter what kind of infill you have, you're still going to have extreme temperatures and heat island effect from the artificial turf.
One thing I've heard among the folks, some of the leadership in town that are proposing the use of artificial turf, is that the science is not definitive yet. The connection between the leaching of PFAS from artificial turf and its connection to polluting waters and streams, especially the medical data, the connection between PFAS and the cancers that are being reported are still inconclusive.
Remember, I discovered PFAS in artificial turf in 2019, so that was not even 4 years ago. So people are just starting now to study how this is leaching off. We have plenty of studies that show that it does leach off and contaminate adjacent waters, wetlands, groundwater, and soil. As far as cancer and PFAS, oh my God, yes, there was the C8 studies. If you haven't watched the movie Dark Waters, which is a docudrama about attorney Rob Bellot and his case against DuPont chemicals. DuPont poisoned an entire town with PFOS and PFOA in West Virginia. This movie is really well done, but it shows you they were forced in the settlement to do what we call the C8 studies, because PFOS and PFOA, which are the 2 oldest PFAS, have 8 carbons. So their C8 stands for 8 carbons. There is no doubt that they cause cancer. They cause cancer. And in EPA's proposed MCL that came out on March 29th, it says it in black and white. There is no safe level. They say it does cause cancer. And in their press release, they say by regulating these chemicals in drinking water, we are going to be saving thousands of lives every year. Do we know that every PFAS causes cancer? No, we don't. We've only studied about 29 of them. And there's this really great website, which I can put in the chat if you want, called PFAS Tox Database. And that shows you all of the human studies on all of the PFAS. Every one we've studied gives you adverse health impacts. Have we proven that every PFAS causes cancer? No, but the PFAS coming off of these turf fields, they do. So the science is settled.
Just one follow-up question. I've also heard that the PFAS levels coming off of artificial turf fields is no greater than the background level already found pretty much everywhere you look in the soil.
That's a Laura Green talking point. I hear it all the time. So what they use is this one study from Vermont that showed PFAS levels in the soil. So one thing to be aware of is that ski wax that people put on cross-country skis and downhill skis, ski wax has PFAS. Vermont is a huge ski place, both cross-country skiing and downhill skiing. Their soils are probably more contaminated than ours are, for example. But here's the bottom line. Even if your soils are contaminated with PFAS, there's nothing you can do except wait. There's nothing. Some people have tried planting certain plants which take it out, but then it's in the plant. And what do you do with the plant? You can't landfill it, you can't burn it. So the only thing we can do is wait. PFAS is additive because the half-life of this stuff is so long, because they are forever chemicals. Think about it. If you got soil that has PFAS, and then you put artificial turf on top that's got more PFAS and that PFAS leaches off, you're just going to have more PFAS. So it's not an argument for saying, well, we've already got PFAS in our soil, so we can put more down, because it doesn't work that way. That's like saying, well, I already ate one cupcake, and even though I'm on a diet, I may as well eat the other 11 in this baker's dozen because, I already ate one, so what difference does it make? It doesn't work that way.
We'll go to Beth and then David Schreiber. Beth?
Thank you, Kyla. I feel like I learn so much every time I'm fortunate enough to hear you speak. I wanted to ask what the 3 watersheds were, and I also wanted to let Jean Benson know that the Poets Corner, the known as Arlington Keating Road dump, which was an unlined dump, that is part of the Charles River watershed. There's a culverted Clematis Brook underground, and then a large wetland underground, but it's the Charles River watershed, not Mystic River there. The rest of the town is Mystic River. So what were the other 2 watersheds that you said we could use the residual designation thing for?
It's the Charles, the Mystic, and the Neponset.
Excellent, excellent. Thank you. So we're covered. Okay, that's all. Thank you so much.
You're welcome.
Okay, David.
I have observed, and cannot quite pin this down, that there has been a push in many towns in the state for artificial turf, not just in the state, but in some of our neighboring states. I haven't been able to reach across the country. Who is pushing this? What organization? Whether it be a marketing group, well, then somebody's funding them. I'd love to track it to its source. I don't understand why suddenly, every time I turn around, some other community is battling against fake turf. Thanks.
There's a group called the Synthetic Turf Council. We actually have evidence that this was a while ago, back in, I think, 2007. There was actually a little bit of looked like a kickback scheme from the emails we got through a public records request, where they were actually paying town employees to push artificial turf in their town. Is that still happening? I have no idea. But it wasn't my work. Somebody else did that work and got those documents. So I'd have to look into it a little bit more. But I think it's partially this myth that they're selling us, that if you have artificial turf, your son will be the next Tom Brady. that, you know, they made this false dichotomy between either you can play sports on an artificial turf field or you don't get to play sports at all. And that's a false dichotomy. It's a straw man argument that they put up there. And people are just swept into it, you know, and they lie to you. They lie about the recyclability. They lie about the chemicals coming off of it. They lie about the safety. They lie about the maintenance. They lie about the cost. And so people buy it. Even in my town, I gave a presentation and said, please don't put this stuff in. And they said, well, Dr. Bennett, we so appreciate your expertise, but we Googled it and it looks safe to us. So now we're spending $9 million on a filtration plant because we have 2 artificial turf fields in town. We have 6 wells, and the 2 wells that are closest to those 2 artificial turf fields are the ones that are the most contaminated that led to. Now, can I prove that the PFAS coming off these fields is what contaminated those wells? No, I can't. But the circumstantial evidence is there.
I think what is needed, Jordan, is to find a journalist who will be a real bulldog about this and go after it and publicize it, because otherwise we are going to be constantly chasing one lie or another.
And we've had media coverage in the Boston Globe, in the Intercept, in a lot in E&E News. E&E News has been great. They've done a great series on it. It's been Philadelphia Inquirer just had a 2-part series on the brain tumors in the Philadelphia Phillies from artificial turf. So we are getting media coverage, but people just don't believe it. And part of the problem is that because PFAS is colorless, odorless, and tasteless, people have their glass of water and they say, looks fine to me. I don't know what you're talking about. And, you know, the cancer doesn't come right away. It doesn't come the day after you play on the field. It comes years after you play on the field. So it's really hard to people are sold this bill of goods that it's the gold standard. It's what you need if you want your athletes to be at Division I schools. It'll be maintenance free. It'll be cheaper for the town. It's all lies, but people buy it because they want to believe it.
Tracy, you have a question.
So I know a lot of people on this call, and thanks for giving me a moment. I live in Medway. We have 3 fields in our town. I've tracked many fields across the state, and back in 2013, 2014, the industry actually created an organization called the Safe Field Alliance. And if you look that up, they actually stole the domain from Safe Healthy Playing Fields at one point and redirected it to their site. We were able to get it back. They are actually backed by the industry, but that time around 2014 was a very intense time of a lot of towns fighting. It was when Amy Griffin's story came out on NBC Nightly News. It was just a heightened period where the industry, there's record of them asking their synthetic turf council members to sell harder to their communities and fight back against activists like all of you here. Kyla's right. They lie. They're not to be trusted. I think the reason we're seeing it more in our communities, though, David, is because they have oversaturated the professional market. Now the professional market is fighting back, and it is selling that field of dreams where everybody's child is going to be a star athlete. We're seeing it more in daycares. They just built a daycare in Medway that is covered in it. And I'm appalled by it with a underlying shock pad of the recycled compressed rubber, Kyla, which you heard Chris Huntress talk about the other evening, which was more BS about what that is. He admitted that it's automotive rubber waste and a mix of a lot of unknowns, but it is called recycled. So I do think, David, you're right. We're seeing it in every town, but it's because they've saturated the pro and the collegiate markets, and they need to keep selling. The last number I heard was that it's a $6 billion industry, and they are absolutely tied into the tire industry, the oil industry, Dow, 3M, and DuPont in the heaviest way possible. So it's a huge monster to tackle, but I encourage all of you to keep doing what you're doing at the local level and follow those state bills and support those state bills.
All right. Thank you, Tracy. Robin, you have a question from chat?
So my question is, I wanted to know more about organic fields, because what we keep being told is that people will not be able to play on it enough, that you need to have the field rest for long periods of time in between, so they won't get enough playing time. And I wanted to know more about that.
So that point is one that I have to concede a little bit to the artificial turf industry. You do get more playing time, not always, but you can get more playing time off of an artificial turf field. Is it a significant difference? No, not if you have a well-constructed, well-maintained grass field. And that's the problem, because a lot of these municipal DPWs, they don't know how to construct a field and how to maintain it properly. If you look at the city of Springfield, Massachusetts, they have organic grass fields, and they're a city of 150,000, and they get all the playing time they need, and it works just fine. So there are ways to do it. The town of Sharon, who put a moratorium in, we successfully fought them off in the town of Sharon. They're putting in a grass field, and they hired somebody who really knows what they're doing to put in the grass field and build it correctly from the get-go. And then you can have a field that gets almost as much playing time as an artificial turf field. And the other thing I'd just like to say is that with climate change, the artificial turf fields are going to have, the playing time is going to go down. We're going to have more days like today, which if there were kids playing on their artificial turf fields today, they probably shouldn't have been, because it probably was over 120 degrees. You're going to have more extreme precipitation events like we saw in Fort Lauderdale. I don't know if you saw those pictures of the airports under 2 feet of water. In a regular field, it'll drain. In an artificial turf field, it doesn't. So when we start having these climate change induced weather events, whether it's the hot days or the heavy rains, we're going to have less playing time on the artificial turf field, and it will even out. But if you get a well-designed, well-built grass field, you can compete with the playing hours. And Rachel Massey has a lot of information on that. So when she shows up to your town meeting, she should be able to answer that question better than I am able to.
Okay, Winnell, you had a question?
I understand, I have not been able to find this in writing, but I understand from a parent that the athletics safety department or people at our Arlington High School actually instructs the student athletes who play on our high school artificial turf field in how to fall so as to not injure themselves in ways that sound ludicrous to think about, you know, somebody being tackled or taking a fall while playing soccer, that they have to be conscious about how, if, and where they allow themselves to make contact with this stuff. And I just want to echo what people have been saying with all these known dangers, and the trade-off being more playing days, which in actuality equates to greater exposure to these known dangers. It's really mind-boggling why so many parents in particular are not up in arms about this. And it really concerns me that they are willing to expose their children this way. And that's my comment. Thank you.
There are some towns that have warning signs, which do help raise awareness. They have warning signs that say, you know, do not eat after touching this field, take a shower immediately, change your clothes before you get in a car. Those things scare people a little bit, but probably not enough, but it's all true. You really, if your kids do play on artificial turf, you should not have them get into your car with their playing clothes on. They should probably shower at the school. But that dust gets into the school. I have a friend who's a teacher in Mansfield, and he said that in the springtime, when his windows are open, or the early fall, that the whole classroom is covered with a layer of black dust from the artificial turf field that's right next door to him. So it's dangerous because you can inhale the PFAS and all the other chemicals.
Which also raises the liability issue. once again, beyond those who merely play on the fields.
Eileen, Ryan hasn't had a question yet.
I was going to actually talk about the legislation as well, but if Cobble wants to talk about it, I'm the leader of Beyond Plastics Greater Boston, and we are supporting the bill to ban municipalities from installing artificial turf. I put this in the chat with the numbers, but I know this is being recorded. So the bill numbers are Senate Bill 2057 and the House Bill is 958. And if people want to join our group, Beyond Plastics Greater Boston, they can write to me. That's our email, beyondplasticsgreaterboston@gmail.com. Thank you.
Well, since you've brought up the subject, why don't you give us a bit of a summary of what the bills would do and where they stand in the legislative process?
Well, they're basically the same bill, but what they are going to do is ban municipalities. I don't have the exact language in front of me right now. So it won't be like private schools would probably still be able to install artificial turf, but no public schools and no, cities could actually put artificial turf down. But if Cobble's on the call, she probably knows more about it. Or even Tracy, I think Tracy Stewart spoke earlier. She might know more also.
No, Cobble is here. Cobble, go for it.
Thanks. Yeah, really, I just want to say this is a great presentation. I'm so honored to even be able to see this presentation. So thank you all for putting this together. The legislation has been filed. The Senate bill, which was filed by Senator Pacheco, who used to be an old groundskeeper. So he has actually the experience of what it was like before there was artificial turf. It is a placeholder language that is currently there, and it is in the regulatory committee in the Senate. On the House side, the numbers that are current now, the 958 will change because it is still an HD, meaning it is a docket and it has not gone into committee. And the reason it hasn't gone into committee is because I've been working with California on their bill, which they just filed last month. And so I used their language and gave it to Carmen Gentile, who filed it for me in the House. And it basically will ban it from private schools and public schools. And we are using that similar language of if PFAS is detected, you can't use it, because that is the industry selling point now, is that it is PFAS free. And so we want, California is ahead of the curve on this. It's in everybody's lawn out there, and that's just kind of like a new idea here in Massachusetts. And so we really wanted to follow California's lead because, they also have a 1-year legislative cycle and we have a 2-year legislative cycle, which means their bill and their hearing and all of the testimony is going to probably come up before ours does. I don't know which committee this is going to go into. It could very well not go into the same committee that it's in the Senate. So just kind of stay tuned for that. I do have an intern starting on May 12th that will be kind of help keep everybody abreast to all of the moving parts, the moving pieces, how many co-sponsors there are, and doing all of that organizing for me. But I do anticipate that we'll have a hearing possibly late in the fall of this year or maybe next year. And the caveat to all of this is that I found out the executive director of the NFL is anti-turf and will be testifying. Something that I did not know about turf is that athletes can move faster on turf, which is causing more serious injuries. And that is one of the primary reasons that he has now had it with turf. So stay tuned.
Do you know where our reps and senators stand on those bills? Sean Garbely is one of our reps. Dave Rogers is the other, and Cindy Friedman is our state senator.
Yes, so they are in support. Friedman's been filing a PFAS bill for years. I originally tried to get Rep. Rogers to file this bill back in 2018. He just didn't have the appetite for it. But now I have lots of legislators talking about it. They're seeing the increase in the bullish tactics of the industry coming into their towns. They are worried about liability. The underlying issue for cities and towns is where is the money for the groundskeepers and to be able to keep that field. And so they want to work with mayors and city councilors on this, but we have way more support than we did back in 2018 when I was originally trying to get this bill filed. Garbally so he's on the Global Warming Solutions Committee. He is in favor as well. So we need the language to like get everybody on record. And so we're gonna have to, once this language gets sorted out, which I've been meeting with Gentile and we're almost there. And the Sierra Club also, their PFAS committee is also prioritizing this. So just once we have it all, on the House side, you will see it in real time. On the Senate side, you won't, because it will be filed as an amendment and it won't show up on the website the way it does in the House, but they will be the same bills.
Eugene, you had your hand up earlier. Do you still want to say something?
Just really briefly, when getting back to your comment about the amount of playing time, what you have to subtract from the amount of playing time, if this artificial turf field goes in, is the amount of hours that will only be able to be used by Belmont Hill School and Arlington Catholic High. I haven't done all of the math, but it looked to me like when you subtract those hours where the town won't have access to the fields, there's actually will be less time that the town and its teams will have to use the fields than they do now.
We'd like to thank all of you for coming this evening, and we hope that you're leaving better informed about artificial turf, about PFAS in particular, and have a little better understanding of the Article 12 substitute motion that would create a study committee and a moratorium while it's being studied. We're going to be holding a second forum on this subject with a different guest. This is going to be this coming Sunday afternoon, April 16th at 3. And the guest is Jeff Gerhardt. He's the Director of Research at the Ecology Center based in Michigan. And you'll find a link in the chat to register. We'll also be sending out invitations to that, to everybody who's on our email list. If you're a town meeting member, we'd appreciate, again, your support for our substitute motion at town meeting. If you're not a town meeting member, we would like to ask you to contact your town meeting members from your precinct and to find out which precinct you live in. If you don't know, you can follow the links that we now have in the chat right now. There's a precinct map. You can identify your precinct, and also once you do that, there's a link to the full list of town meeting members, both the new ones that have just been elected and the ones who are returning. Thanks to all of you for attending. Thanks to Dr. Bennett, whose link is also in the chat, and we hope to see many of you this Sunday afternoon at 3. Good night, everybody. Thank you.